Alright, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. This is my last video of presentation for international criminal law, which under topic war crimes. So let me introduce myself. My name is Hizra Nabihah binti AZHAR, and my metric number is 059205. Let's figure out what I have know about war crimes, and I will explain more about war crimes in this video. So let's begin with the introduction. Alright, as I know, even though the prohibition of certain behavior in the conduct of armed conflict can be traced back many centuries, the concept of war crimes developed particularly at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, when international humanitarian law, also known as the law of armed conflict, was codified. The Hague Conventions, adopted in 1899 and 1907, focus on the prohibition to warring parties to use certain means and methods of warfare. Several other related treaties have been adopted since then. In contrast, the Geneva Convention on 1864 and subsequent Geneva Conventions, notably the four 1949 Geneva Conventions and the two 1977 additional protocols, focus on the protection of persons not or no longer taking part in hostilities. Both Hague Law and Geneva Law identify several of the violations of its norm, though not all, as war crimes. However, there is no one single document in international law that codifies all war crimes. Lists of war crimes can be found in humanitarian law and international criminal law treaties, as well as in international customary law. The 1949 Geneva Conventions have been ratified by all member states of the United Nations, while the additional protocols and other international humanitarian law treaties have not yet reached the same level of acceptance. However, many of the rules contained in these treaties have been considered as part of customary law and as such are binding on all states and other parties to the conflict, whether or not states have ratified the treaties themselves. In addition, many rules of customary international law apply in both international and non-international armed conflict, expanding in this way the protection afforded in non-international armed conflicts, which are regulated only by common Article 3 of the four Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 2. A war crime is a violation of the laws of war that gives rise to individual criminal responsibility for actions by combatants in action, such as intentionally killing civilians or intentionally killing prisoners of war, torture, taking hostage, unnecessarily destroying civilian property, deception by perfidy, wartime sexual violence, pillaging, and for any individual that is part of the common structure who orders any attempt to committing mass killings, including genocide or ethnic cleansing, the granting of no quarter despite surrender, the conscription of children in the military, and flouting the legal distinctions of proportionality and military necessity. It is stated in the Article 8 about war crimes as we know that the court shall have jurisdiction in respect of war crimes, in particular when committed as part of a plan or policy or as part of a large-scale commission of such crimes. For the purpose of this statute, war crimes means grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 12 August 1949, namely any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provisions of the relevant Geneva Convention, which included willful killing, torture or inhuman treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial, unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement, taking hostage, other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict, within the established framework of international law, namely any of the following acts: intentionally directing attack against the civilian population as such or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities. Intentionally directing attacks against objects that is objects which are not military objectives. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel, installations, material, units or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping mission in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, as long as they are entitled to the protection given to the civilians or civilian objects under the international law of armed conflict. Intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian object or widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. Attacking or bombarding by whatever means towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives. Killing or wounding a combatant who, having laid down his arms or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion. War crimes are those violations of international humanitarian law, treaty or customary law that incur individual criminal responsibility under international law. As a result, and in contrast to the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, war crimes must always take place in the context of an armed conflict, either international or non-international. From a more substantive perspective, war crimes could be divided into: firstly, war crime against persons requiring particular protection; second, war crime against those providing humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping operations; thirdly, war crimes against property and other rights; fourth, prohibited methods of warfare; and fifth, prohibited means of warfare. Some examples of prohibited acts include murder, mutilation, cruel treatment and torture, taking hostage, intentionally directing attack against the civilian population, intentionally directing attack against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science or charitable purpose, historical monuments or hospitals, pillaging, rape, sexual slavery, forced pregnancy or any other form of sexual violence, conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15 years into armed forces or groups, or using them to participate actively in hostilities. War crimes contain two main elements. A contextual element: the conduct took place in the context of and was associated with an international or non-international armed conflict. A mental element: intent and knowledge, both with regards to the individual act and the contextual element. In contrast to genocide and crime against humanity, war crimes can be committed against a diversity of victims, either combatants or non-combatants, depending on the type of crime. In international armed conflicts, victims include wounded and sick members of armed forces in the field and at sea, prisoners of war, and civilian persons. In the case of non-international armed conflicts, protection is afforded to persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of armed forces who have laid down their arms and those placed hors de combat by sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause. In both types of conflicts, protection is also afforded to medical and religious personnel, humanitarian workers, and civil defense staff. I think that's all from me about the war crimes, and I hope that everyone can understand what have I presented about war crimes just now. And that's all from me. Thank you so much, and thank you to my beloved lecturer, Sir Shafiq, for organizing this presentation. Uh, Thank you.